let's look at the carbon cycle in a little bit more detail. So first of all, we're going to talk about the rock cycle. So here I've got some metamorphic rocks. They once upon a time were layers of sedimentary rocks, but due to huge pressures and temperatures, they have been contorted and bent into all sorts of shapes. Now, on top of my metamorphic rocks, I've got more layers of sedimentary rocks which have been deposited down according to the law of superposition, which says that the layers at the bottom are the oldest and the layers at the top are the youngest. Alright, so I'm laying down more layers of rock, and to give you an idea, there's probably about 60 million gigatons of carbon stored in rocks around the world. Okay, so just 60 million gigatons. Just think about that. That is a huge quantity of carbon. And I've just want you to cast your mind back. Well, not that you could possibly do this, but think about the Jurassic period, a time when the dinosaurs were roaming the earth, and actually a time before flowers even exist, but there were a lot of plants, okay, and there were also a lot of phytoplanktons in the ocean. So we had high temperatures due to large amounts of volcanism, and therefore the earth was probably very green. But those plants obviously died, as everything dies eventually, and they would have possibly been decayed, or they could have been in an environment which prevented decomposition, and in which case they would have been covered by more layers of sediment. And as more layers of sediment covered them, the pressure and temperature would have increased. And we'll talk about why that is important in a little bit. So our layers of sediment are building up over time, over geological history, and now we're up at the very top layers, so the regolith with the soils, and where a lot of the action that I'm going to talk about is occurring. So I'm going to start by talking about volcanism though. So volcanism is probably responsible for the vast majority of carbon dioxide that is in our atmosphere. It has been happening for millions of years, and it's been pumping really large quantities of CO2 into the atmosphere since the dawn of time on Earth. And it's been a really important process, because without that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we wouldn't have a greenhouse effect, and therefore the Earth would be incredibly cold indeed. So that CO2 in the atmosphere is really important, and probably one of the reasons that life has been able to evolve on Earth, because we've had that warming blanket of CO2. Along with the CO2 that was pumped out from volcanism, a whole bunch of water would have also been pumped out. And that water, unlike CO2, can't stay in the atmosphere forever. It gets to a concentration where it starts to saturate the atmosphere, and once it starts saturating the atmosphere, it will precipitate out as rain. Okay, and that rain would have filled up our oceans. So over millions and millions of years, it rained and it rained and it rained, and our oceans became more and more full. There were other sources of water on Earth as well, such as asteroid strikes and things, but volcanism did play a large role in the amount of water in our oceans. So CO2 in the atmosphere interacts with the oceans in a really strong way. So naturally, about 60 gigatons of CO2 is absorbed by our oceans every year, and naturally, this is what should happen, about 62 gigatons is released from the oceans back into the atmosphere every year. So that's what that double-ended arrow there indicates, that we've got a backwards and forwards movement of CO2 between the atmosphere and the ocean. So once CO2 enters the ocean, it doesn't stay as CO2. It actually then undergoes a series of chemical reactions to form first bicarbonate ions, but then also carbonate ions, and that carbonate ion is really important for a lot of organisms. coral reefs and mollusks use the carbonate in the oceans to build their skeletal structures and their shells and so forth. So what eventually happens is, and if you look at coral reefs, they produce huge quantities of structures, like just ginormous amounts of calcium carbonate is basically being produced in coral reefs. So those coral reefs over time will slowly, will die essentially, and they will produce large amounts of calcium carbonate rock. Those calcium carbonate rocks will be buried under large amounts of sedimentary rock, and eventually, like all geology, they will start to move down through the sedimentary layers, and they'll get put under higher and higher temperatures and pressures, and start turning into metamorphic rocks. So we have two main forms of carbonate rocks: the biogenic carbonates, ones produced by organisms, and the carbonate rocks produced just through chemical precipitation. When the oceans become saturated in carbonate, it will precipitate out as things like calcium carbonate, or maybe even manganese carbonate. So you may have heard about the Dolomite Mountains. The Dolomites are predominantly calcium and magnesium carbonate. So as we move down through our carbon cycle, we can see that the carbonate rocks are stored as sedimentary rocks. And just remember, huge quantities of carbon is stored away in rocks all around the world. But those rocks, if they're put under the right conditions, may get to a point where they melt. Okay, and once they start to melt, they might first turn into metamorphic rocks, but then eventually into magma. And if they turn into magma and can then escape again, they can escape through volcanism. Okay, and we have one part of the carbon cycle accounted for. So the oceans probably store about 41,000 gigatonnes of CO2. Now that's a lot of CO2, and our atmosphere, to put that in perspective, our atmosphere probably stores about 840 gigatonnes. So that's 41,000 compared to 840. So the oceans are a really important store of excess carbon dioxide. So another way in which the oceans absorb CO2 is through marine plants such as phytoplankton. So phytoplanktons, through photosynthesis, absorb CO2 and convert it into carbohydrates, and they use those carbohydrates for multiple different reasons. But like all organisms we've already spoken about, they will die, and often those phytoplanktons will sink to the bottom of the ocean and once again storing away a lot of the carbon. So now we're going to look at land. So land biomass is probably responsible for storing about 2,500 gigatonnes of CO2, or carbon I should say, not CO2 but just carbon. So the oceans, we were talking about 41,000 gigatonnes, but then on land we're talking about 2,500 gigatonnes. So once again, the oceans, you can see, are incredibly important in terms of carbon storage. But the land absolutely doesn't negate how important our terrestrial ecosystems are in terms of the carbon cycle. So here we have a forest or a jungle, whatever you want to imagine it as, and in that jungle we have organisms, or animals I should say, which consume the different plants. So the CO2, again through photosynthesis, is sucked in to the plants, and the plants use it to make things like cellulose and sugars, storage molecules such as starch, all sorts of things. And then animals, particularly herbivores, will first consume those plants, and the carbon will travel through the different trophic levels, and eventually those organisms will die. Perhaps they're predated upon, or perhaps they die of old age. And one of two things can happen. Okay, the first thing that could possibly happen is they could decompose. And in that process of decomposition, oxygen is used and CO2 is produced, and the CO2 travels straight back up into the atmosphere. So we had a very short moment there where the CO2 was taken out of the atmosphere while it was living in the body of those organisms, but after decomposition, straight back up into the atmosphere. But some CO2, or some organisms don't decompose, or they'll undergo a different series of chemical reactions that will lead them to turning into organic sedimentary rocks. Okay, so some examples of a really obvious sedimentary type rock would be coal. Okay, so then also they could, if put under the right temperatures and pressures. Let's think back to our Jurassic plants that got covered up. They may, if they're under the right temperature and pressures, may turn into substances like crude oil. And once they turn into crude oil, that might migrate through porous rocks and they might collect in a suitable geological structure. So I've drawn here that you can imagine that that was our Jurassic plants, and they've collected there in that little geological structure, which technically they would sit and stay if humans didn't remove them. So you can say that fossil fuels around the planet are probably, in all the different stores, are probably responsible for locking away about 10,000 gigatonnes of carbon. So, but let's just leave our stored carbon there for a moment, and because then we can talk about our organic rocks, and as those rocks get put under high temperatures and pressures, they'll turn into metamorphic rocks, and then they'll be buried away deep in the earth, stopping the carbon from re-entering the atmosphere, until, of course, they might undergo a series of chemical reactions or melt and turn back into magma, in which case they could then have a route by which they could enter the atmosphere again through volcanism. But humans are vastly changing this cycle. So there we have the natural carbon cycle. And it's been like that for millennia and been relatively stable. Of course, it has changed over time, but it has been relatively stable. But over the past 200 years, or since the Industrial Revolution, humans have been dramatically impacting the carbon cycle. And the way we've been doing that is by drilling for fossil fuels such as oil. So what I have here is a oil rig. And just happens to be, very unusually, but happens to be attached to a power plant. So the oil is extracted and then is transported to a power plant sometimes, in which case it is burnt. And when it is burnt, a lot of energy is released, which we use, but also a lot of CO2 is produced. So that CO2 is increasing the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere, and therefore really impacting the carbon cycle, or the natural carbon cycle. So to give you an idea, I mentioned that the oceans used to absorb about 60 gigatonnes per year, but now they're absorbing more like 80 gigatonnes per year of carbon. Now, that is a dramatic change, going from 60 to 80, and something's got to give, because when the oceans absorb more carbon dioxide, they're producing more bicarbonate ions, and these bicarbonate ions actually also produce hydrogen ions. Now, the fact that they're producing hydrogen ions, some of you might recognize that as an acid, and that is making our oceans more acidic over time, and that can be really detrimental to a lot of the marine organisms, and thereby detrimental to us. So there we have it. That is the carbon cycle. On the left hand side, more the natural carbon cycle, but then over there on the right hand side you see us extracting the fossil fuel and burning it, and then that is then impacting the natural carbon cycle. All right, so I'll leave it there.